Alright, so I'm making this video because I think there's a significant problem with the way the matchmaker functions currently. I don't think this is going to be a big surprise to anybody who plays this game, whether it's once a month or every day. Pretty sure everybody shares the same sentiment that there's something wrong with the matchmaker. That being said, what I'm talking about is probably not going to be the first thing that comes to mind for most people, but some of it will be. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about what I think is the biggest problem with the matchmaker currently, and then what I think could be done to fix it. So after this, I'm going to talk about the most broken and overpowered tanks and what should be done about those. Then I'm going to briefly just go over matchmaking overall and some of the things I usually hear when people talk about it being broken. Then after that, I'm going to go into some in-game examples of what I'm talking about. And then I'm going to give a brief overview of my idea. And then I'm going to go in depth into the mechanics of how it could be implemented possibly. But it's just a concept. It's not really, that's really what matters. So first and foremost, when we're talking about balancing this game, we're gonna have to talk about stuff like the Chieftain, 279, and BZ. I think these tanks are actively destroying the game, and they should be either completely removed or nerfed into the ground. But since Wargaming is doing nothing about them, and as far as I know, has no plans of doing anything about them, then we're gonna need a band-aid for them. I think these tanks should get the EBR treatment, where if you're gonna have a battle with one of these things, there needs to be one on the other team. And since they're gonna be playing generally the same kind of positions, they're at least gonna have to fight each other, and that's gonna get rid of games where one team just simply doesn't have a counter for these things. Another thing that would be simple to implement that I think should go along with what I just said is there should be a limit to the amount of tanks you could bring in a platoon for stuff like this. So it would be like you would be limited to one chieftain per platoon or 279 or whatever it is, and that'll prevent like cringe lords going within a 3 chieftain platoon or 3 BZ 176 platoon, whatever it is. Not only does that ruin the game for people on both teams, but it's simply impossible to balance, and I just don't see a reason that it should be possible in game. There's also some other things, or some other tanks that could probably use that rule, and like maybe version 4s, you could be limited to one per platoon, or throw in your stage 4 cancer like the 4K, Death Star, Cobra, stuff like that. I think you should not really be able to bring more than one of those per platoon. All right, so I was watching the stream a few days ago, and I got this game where an enemy team, full tier 10, 3 artillery. So right off the bat, this is just really not going to be a very fun time for anybody. So this team, they got 5 heavy tanks, a couple of mediums. So of their 5 heavies, they got double mouse, 277, ST2, VZ. I mean, double mouse is kind of strange, but it's not that uncommon. It's like pretty average tier 10 heavy tank lineup. So just based off this, you could probably imagine what the other side got. That's right, they got 4 chieftains. So not only did they get a triple platoon of chieftains, the matchmaker, just for shits and giggles, said, you know what would be funny? I throw the single chieftain over there too. So this team got 6 tier 10 heavy tanks, which is one more than the other team, along with quad chieftain. So I may have noticed this map is El Haloof, which means about 90% of games are going to be decided by this fight up here. And this team got 4 chieftains and 3 arty. So just imagine you're one of these heavy tanks. You have to fight 4 chieftains and 3 arty on El Haloof. I don't understand how Wargaming can just release this as their product. This kind of garbage is costing this game players by the day. Who wants to play this? I don't understand. It is so bad. Like, imagine you're this ST2, you come home from work, I got a couple hours to play World of Tanks, get my daily doubles in, whatever. I'm gonna play this new double barrel tier 10 heavy tank I got. It should be fun. You get fucking El Haloof with 4 arty, or no, 4 chieftains and 3 arty. Who wants to play this? It is such a bad product. Wargaming like is killing the game, clearly. I just don't understand why. It makes no sense. And this is the game that you get to experience once you've made it past low tiers and you finish your grinding and all that kind of stuff. So that is assuming the players even get to this point. But a lot of new players probably stop playing the game when they see people like this who they got 20,000 games in the M44. With people combined about 30k games in the T67, tier 2s, tier 3s, whatever you pick. There's like thousands of people like this out there. I can't even imagine how many new players have quit the game because of people like this. Problem is, there's really not much you can do about this. especially nowadays where I think Wargaming gives people like a tier 6 token to get some tech tree tier 6 when they finish the boot camp. But I mean, I don't know, this is just one of those things that contributes to the game dying. It's the new player experience is just so bad. Nobody wants to play it. And I can't even blame them honestly, because I've been playing this game for years, and the new player experience is probably just as bad as the old player experience, because this game is just, the devs don't know what they're doing. They just, I honestly swear to God, they either have never played the game in their life and have no idea what it's like to play their game, or they know exactly what it's like to play their game and they hate the people that play it, because I really don't see another possible scenario where the devs could make the decisions they do to change this game. And just on the topic of the Chieftain 279 stuff, just one more for the road here. We got a Paris game, full tier 10. Both teams get 2 tier 10 heavy tanks. We got a double T57 heavy, and they got 279 in Chieftain. So, you know, pretty balanced. So there are things about the current matchmaker that can be realistically changed, and others that cannot. I feel like a lot of the things I see when people talk about the matchmaker and how they would fix it, they're generally just either unrealistic in terms of the tanks and tiers that are being played, or in terms of what you could realistically implement into a matchmaker like World of Tanks has, without it being insanely complicated and just taking forever to work. So of the main things you generally see, one of the most popular has to be skill-based matchmaking. And I think for random battles, it's just not a good idea. I think they should just be balanced by tanks alone. To implement a system that would balance tanks and player skill at the same time would be extremely hard. I think people just don't take into account the variables with the matchmaker, like the tanks or tiers being played, or if you implement a skill-based matchmaking system, a combination of the two with player skill. There are modes with skill-based matchmaking, like advances or onslaught, where the matchmaker is balancing based on elo alone, completely independent of anything else. And these, obviously, in these modes where advances, the teams choose their tanks, or an onslaught, people choose their tanks individually when they see the map. I don't think it's possible for pubs and tanks, and I don't even think it's really necessary to have that. Another very common thing you'll see is the +1 -1 matchmaking. And I think in a perfect world, it would probably be a good idea, but we don't live in a perfect world, and a lot of things that people really don't take into account when they say that they should implement +1 -1. So I found this video. I really thought there was a video where the devs, they made an in-depth video of how the mechanics of the matchmaker worked, but I really couldn't find it, even though I thought it existed. But I found this. This is from 4 years ago, when they basically loosened up the template system. Remember, like 357, 510, that kind of stuff. But they briefly discuss how the matchmaker works, even though it really doesn't, it's not super specific, but it functions for the purpose of what I'm talking about. So we're gonna watch this for a second.
When a player selects a vehicle and clicks the battle button, they are placed in a queue. Imagine a big waiting room that gradually collects vehicles of different tiers. It depends on the vehicle choice of thousands of players what vehicles end up in the queue. The queue changes all the time because of that. Different numbers of vehicles of different tiers are constantly added to it. The vehicles wait in this room until there are enough vehicles of the necessary tiers for the matchmaker to send them into battle. The waiting time depends on the number of players in the queue and on the tiers of the vehicles that they chose. After the matchmaker selected a template, took the appropriate vehicles from the queue, allocated the vehicles to the two teams and chose a map, it finally sends the players into battle. Before update 9.18, the queue and the vehicle ratio in the game looked something like this. There were 4 times as many Tier 8 vehicles as there were Tier 10 ones. With such a vehicle-tier ratio, the main 357 template worked well and could quickly process the queue. In order to send Tier 10 vehicles into 3-tier battles, it needed to take some Tier 9 and 8 vehicles. The rest of the vehicles played battles at their respective tiers. Over the last 2 years, the queue and the vehicle ratio changed significantly. Now it looks like this. There are half as many Tier 10 vehicles as there are Tier 8 ones. There was also an increase in the number of Tier 9 vehicles. However, the number of Tiers 7 and 6 decreased. It so happened that the matchmaker now works in a completely new environment with its old tools. If it continues to send the same number of Tier 10 vehicles to battle, it will take twice as many Tier 8 ones. It means half of those Tier 8 vehicles will be playing at the bottom of the list. At the same time, if there are not enough Tier 8 vehicles, the matchmaker will send Tier 10s to same tier and 2-tier battles.
This is why the matchmaker creates such
All right. So this is important. So I have no data for this, obviously, but I think it's pretty obvious that Tier 10 in the 4 years since this video was released has probably eclipsed Tier 9, as well as like Tier 7 and 6 probably also decreasing. Tier 9, I think, probably has decreased. Tier 8 has gone up too. So given how Tier 9 would be sandwiched between the two most popular tiers in the game, as well as Tier 7 being such a small amount compared to Tier 8, I do not see how +1 -1 matchmaking could function with this. You'd probably end up having like 80% of your Tier 10 games being all Tier 10, and on potentially maybe even more at Tier 8. I personally don't see how it could be possible. I don't think +1 -1 is a bad idea. I think in a perfect world it would probably be a good idea, but especially on the less populated servers, I don't think it's feasible in the slightest. I genuinely think the entire dilemma of people playing against 2-tier higher tanks or higher tier tanks, whatever it is, I genuinely think the biggest reason it's a problem is because of the map design. The map design is just, it's so bad, and it's constantly forcing you into frontal and hull down fights. It is so bad for lower tiers, and I mean it's just bad for the game overall, but lower tiers, there's essentially nothing you can do on any of these maps. Like I don't know, I don't understand what the map developers are thinking when they're making these maps and they make these changes, like Airfield recently. I don't, somehow against all odds they made Airfield worse. Like it's actually impressive how they did it. Uh, but I mean this is a rant for a different time. So I think that's that. All right, so now I'm going to go over some in-game examples of the kind of thing that I think is a problem and could realistically be fixed by wargaming. So just to preface this, heavy tanks are the most influential tank class in the game, and it's really just not up for discussion unless the map is named Prokhorovka, potentially Malinovka if it's in standard mode. But in this game, we got full tier 10, no Arty, Sand River. The enemy team got a 279 and double super conk for their 3 heavy tanks. We only got 2 heavy tanks, and they were an IS-7 and VZ. So not only did they get the better side for playing K-Line, they got 2 of the best tech tree tanks in the game and a 279. We got an IS-7 and a VZ. So we got rolled in this game. Probably didn't even really have to tell you that. Of course, there are a few people on my team with prescription helmets, but this game was completely decided by matchmaking when they picked these teams. Another game. This is not nearly as egregious. This is just kind of a thing I want to talk about. Each team got 3 heavy tanks. We got double super heavy E5. They got double autoloader 260. So we got the super heavies and autoloaders are not evenly distributed for essentially just no reason at all. And among them, each team got 5 medium tanks, and they got a Progetto and TVP. So of their 8 combat tanks, half of them were autoloaders. Of our 8 combat tanks, 0 were autoloaders. So I think that really not balanced. Then we got here, Westfield. No Arty. Each team got 1 tier 10 heavy, a few tier 9 heavy tanks, stuff like that. The enemy team got a T57, an M6Y, Motion 4502B, and then for the tier 8s, they got a couple defenders. We got an E5, double phase 1, and then a triple BZ platoon. So essentially, every single one of these tanks is just going to dominate this ridge line. They got 0 to do so. We absolutely steamrolled this enemy team. Like, we took them for a walk. I think it was 15-0, but maybe 15-1. Like this, I mean, obviously I discussed the BZ platoon. This should just not even be possible. But the matchmaker is just, the way it distributes these tanks, this enemy team essentially had no chance to win as soon as they were put into this game with this matchmaking. There's another one, tier 9. Each team gets a tier 9 heavy. We got a chieftain prototype. They got a 5120, and then some medium tanks. So of their medium tanks, they got triple char for some reason and a standard B. So of their 6 tier 9 combat tanks, 5 of them were autoloaders. Of our 6 tier 9 combat tanks, 0 were autoloaders. So I don't see how the matchmaker can put this together and think it's balanced. It makes no sense to me. Here's another one, Lakeville. We got a 279 Chieftain double super conch. They got some garbage tier 10 heavies. We got another one. They got 5 heavy tanks. We got 6, and of our 6 heavy tanks, 3 were super conchs, and we had a chieftain. So I mean, I think you probably get the point by now. I don't think matchmaker has any reason to function this way. It's balancing tanks based on their tier and class alone, and nothing else. Supposedly, in the video that I watched earlier, they had said that they balanced super heavies and autoloaders, but if we go back to this, I don't think that's even true, to be honest. But either way, it needs to be more in depth than this. This kind of stuff, like this kind of stuff, just shouldn't be possible in a competitive game. You can laugh all you want, competitive game. There are people on each team fighting each other to try and win, and that's a competitive game. And to have the matchmaker influence games this heavily, it's just unnecessary, and it ruins the game. Honestly, like when I loaded in this game, I basically knew automatically we were gonna lose. So I think it definitely needs to be fixed. All right, so now we're briefly going to discuss what I think should be done in the matchmaker to balance teams more. I really only think what I'm going to talk about, it would be necessary for tiers 8 to 10, although I haven't played anything lower than that in a really long time, so I'm not entirely sure what the balance is like down there. So like I said earlier, heavy tanks are the most influential class in the game. So obviously they would require the most complex balancing of all the classes. They generally tend to suffer from imbalance the most, like I was talking about in my in-game examples earlier. So balancing for them, I think, should be done based on characteristics relative to the map that's being played at the time. So for example, like a super conch wouldn't be balanced the same way on Safe Haven as it would on Westfield. I can't really think of a way to discuss what I mean simply here. So when I go in more in depth later, I'm gonna go over matchmaking scenario and all that kind of stuff to actually talk about what I mean. All right, so then we have medium tanks. And as the little brother combat tank of heavy tanks, I think they would kind of require the same characteristic and map-based balancing. However, it would probably be less in-depth, and I think how they're distributed to the teams would be relative to how the heavy tanks are distributed to the teams. And I'll go over what I mean later when I go over all the mechanics of how it could work. Now we have light tanks. So light tanks have some pretty important jobs, especially on certain maps. And the job is scouting. And some light tanks are better scouts than others. And there's no doubt about that. I don't think I've ever lost a game because my team got a worse damage dealing light tank than the other team. So with that in mind, I would like to see a 3-rank system to balance light tanks based on their ability to scout alone. And I think that is just because scouting is the most important thing a light tank can do, and that is where you see the most imbalance. So, for example, tier 10 light tanks, the Manticore and the T100 are the best scouting light tanks. This is excluding the EBR, of course, because EBR gets matchmaking separately against only other EBRs. And then your worst are going to be your 132-1 in Sheridan, and then somewhere in the middle, you're going to see your 13105 and the Panzerwagon. So what a system like this would essentially do is it would separate light tanks at the top rank from the bottom rank. I think the matchmaker could probably look for a pair of light tanks at the same rank, but if it can't find one, it could look for one at a separate rank, but the maximum difference would be 1. So rank 3 would not be able to fight rank 1, but it could potentially fight a rank 2 tank. And something like this would essentially remove any possibility of like a Sheridan facing off against a Manticore on proc or something like that. Then you have artillery, which I mean, artillery being balanced is not really going to decide many games, but I think if you're going to implement other stuff, then there's really no reason to not do this. So it'd be the same as the light tanks, except instead of their scouting ability, it would just be how good they are overall. So a tier 10 would be like CGC, T92 at the top, 261, GW in the middle, and then the bat crap at the bottom. Really the only thing this thing is good for is targeting one single person and then making their life a living hell. Then last of all, we have tank destroyers. So tank destroyers are generally not going to be the reason one team beats the other. Although I think there's generally some imbalance you see a lot of the times. I think they should be just categorized into three roles, that being assault, multi-role, and sniper, and then just distributed evenly, uh, as balanced as the matchmaking could with what it has. But like, it's not insanely important. Ignore all this. I'll go over this later. But I mean, if you think you've seen these before, it's because you have. They're in the game currently. So see these. They're actually roles in the game. The only one I left out was support. I don't know what this. I honestly don't know what it is. I think it means like they're autoloaders or something. They have these for a bunch, like every single class right now, except I don't know what the hell they're for. I think it's like cosmetic or something. I think this may have had some impact when ranked battles were still a thing, but I'm not entirely sure what purpose these serve. Maybe like a noob can hover over it or something and see what they're supposed to be doing. Although I mean, wargaming, the way they classify a lot of them, I don't think I don't think they even know. Like sniper medium tank for the 30B, I'm pretty sure the CS is also a sniper. Yeah, sniper medium tank. So I mean, I don't think wargaming even knows how to classify their own vehicles. I think this is a good time to talk about some other changes that I'm generally more opinionated about. Not entirely sure if they would work, but I think they could probably work. These are generally further limits to tank classes and potentially a minimum amount of light tanks for certain maps. So the first thing is artillery. I think it should be limited to one per game, and I realize that would probably guarantee there's an arty in every single game. I don't even really think that's a problem, to be honest. I think artillery serves its purpose if there's only one of them. You know, like picking a one shot that nobody else can, or doing damage to a hull down tank. You know, stunning your teammates, whatever it may be. But I think when there's more than one artillery per team, it just makes the game extremely painful to play. It locks down maps. Any attempt at being aggressive, you just get owned by artillery. I understand that if you limit it even further, there would probably be longer queue times for arty. So I think along with that, you would probably have to decrease the artillery missions a bit, so people aren't forced to play them as much. For people that play artillery for fun, I don't really care how long they sit in queue for, to be honest. And guess what? I mean, if you have trouble with the queue time, you can take the other hand out of your fucking pants and press battle in the real tank. I also think if you're limiting arty like this, you could probably even buff its damage back to where it used to be and just completely get rid of the stun rounds. Because I mean, nobody likes the stun rounds. The arty players hate playing it. They want to do more damage. I think you could just buff the damage, get rid of the stun round, and just have one per team. I think that's what should have been done before. We had to deal with the stun and all this kind of stuff for a while. I just think that is probably the best way to deal with arty as is. In the same way that I think multiple artillery shut down a game, I think a bunch of tank destroyers do the exact same thing. Like, look at this game I had the other day. The enemy team had 9 tank destroyers on it. Luckily for me, the map was safe haven, so a bunch of tank destroyers don't make this map bad. This map is just bad all the time. But I think tank destroyers should probably be limited to 4 per team. But if that's not possible, I think you could even do something like limit the non-assault tank destroyers to 3 per team or something like that, since assault TDs most of the time are going to be playing normal positions, having normal fights, stuff like that. In the same way, I think we should limit RD and TDs. I think we should limit light tanks too. I think the best number would probably be 2 per team is the maximum. But I think just limiting the classes like this would just smooth out the matchmaking from game to game. Would make games more predictable and honestly just more fun on average, not having to deal with a bunch of tank destroyers or like 4 light tanks, 3 RDs, stuff like that. Quickly before I go into the mechanics of the tank distribution and how that would work, I want to talk about a mandatory number of light tanks for certain maps. I think there should be a certain number of light tanks for certain maps, like proc. I think you should have a mandatory 2 light tanks per team. This goes in line with what I've been talking about, where I think the map being played should have an influence on how the tanks are distributed for the teams and how they're assembled. And like, I think there are certain maps like proc where the map becomes extremely bad when there are no light tanks. I mean, most of the time on proc, like I think probably 90% of the time when I get proc and there's no light tanks, it ends up being a draw. And I mean, obviously, there are some medium tanks they can spot, but the the frequency that happens is extremely low. And I just think a mandatory number of light tanks for certain maps would be a good addition to the game. And especially if you're going to limit light tanks overall, I think to have a certain number of light tanks mandatory for certain maps would kind of just smooth out the number of light tanks per map, and it would kind of eat up the excess light tanks from implementing a cap on light tanks for every single game. This may be a topic worth discussing at a different time, but I really don't think the concept is that complicated. Okay, so now for the actual mechanics of how something like this could be implemented while still being simple enough for the matchmaker to manage. It may seem very complicated to balance heavy and medium tanks based on certain abilities relative to the map, but I think it's necessary and it's probably pretty realistic. So, like I said, heavy tanks are the most impactful and require the most detailed balancing. I'm going to try my best to explain this in a way that I feel makes the most sense, but keep in mind that the concept is really what is important here. This is obviously not going to be a perfect method. I also have extremely limited programming experience, so there's more than likely going to be a better way to implement a system like this, but I tried to come up with the best process based on my understanding of how something like this should work. To get the highest amount of information about a tank into the smallest and simplest form, I think a string of numbers would probably be the most effective. Just for the purposes of explaining this, we're going to call this string of numbers the balance value. This value for heavy tanks would have information uh, regarding how good the tank is overall, independent of any individual player's skill level, and then information of whether or not it is acceptable functioning in certain roles. So for heavy tank, these roles would be hull down, gun depression, mobility, armor, and side scraping. I think these qualify the most important roles that heavy tanks will play on maps. However, this may be something I'm missing that I'm just forgetting. The armor category may seem redundant with hull down and side scraping on there, but I think it's just a more broad category for maps maybe like Himmelsdorf or Ruinberg, where there's not really a specific armor profile that's the most effective, but just uh, the ability to do something with your armor overall. So for a heavy tank, the first digit in the value will be a number ranging from 1 to 5 for the tank's overall quality, independent of player skill. And then the next 5 digits will be binary 1 or 0, which represent a yes or no on whether or not it can acceptably function in any of these roles. Now, these roles, this is just the order that I ended up putting them in. The order doesn't matter as long as it's same for every single value. So how is this value used? Well, the map being played will determine how the matchmaker sorts and distributes tanks based on this value. So each map will have 2 balance conditions for heavy tanks and 2 for medium tanks. So for heavy tanks, these 2 balance conditions will be the primary and secondary balance condition, and they will be based off of 2 of these 5 categories that I have here. And for medium tanks, will be based on whatever they have. The balance conditions for heavy tanks will be chosen based on the most impactful positions a heavy tank can play on that map. Alright, so now I'm going to go over a hypothetical matchmaking scenario where I'm going to pretend to be the matchmaker and show you how a system like this would work. So for our example, Westfield is going to be the map. And you ever played Westfield, basically 90% of the games are decided by this fight up here. So for the balance conditions for heavy tanks, I think the primary balance condition would be the ability to go hull down, because there are places up here where you can go hull down, but you don't necessarily need gun depression. And the secondary balance condition would be the ability to have gun depression, because if you can play here with gun depression, and the combination of the two, being able to go hull down and have gun depression, basically just makes you the best possible heavy tank for this fight. Alright, so this is the map for a scenario, and these are the tanks. So these are the tanks that are hypothetically in queue right now. This is going to be all tier 10 example, because tier 10 is really what I care about. But so in our queue right now, we have 3 super conks, an E100, a 277, a mouse, a cron, a 215B, and a 5A. This is like a pretty average assortment of tier 10 heavy tanks. So these have been chosen for our game on Westfield. And then first of all, we have to give them their balance value. So essentially this is what the matchmaker would see. It would just see numbers like this for each of the tanks. And then we take our balance conditions. The primary condition, like I said earlier, is hull down. So this is the first digit after the quality digit, and their secondary condition would be gun depression, which is the third digit in this number. And the matchmaker would essentially just run a check for whatever these two conditions may be. Like it could be any of these digits, whatever it is. Matchmaker runs a check, and it sees whether or not each of these values passes a check for the primary and secondary condition. So here, Superconk is passed the check for both conditions. 277 has only passed the check for the hull down. It's got really no gun depression, stuff like that. And this will decide how the matchmaker sorts these tanks. So here we got them sorted into groups. A, B, C, D. This is 4 groups because in my scenario I had one for each condition. So Group A here has passed both conditions. Group B has only passed the check for the primary condition. C only passed for the secondary condition, and D passed for neither. Within these groups, they're going to be subsorted by their quality number. So top to bottom. Number of groups here is dependent on how many heavy tanks are in the game. So let's say the only heavy tank in this game was the 215B. 215B is in Group A because that is the highest available. And up here you'll see A1, and A1 is a relevant value for balancing the medium tanks. So A1 is essentially just a value, and it is how many in the highest group have the highest quality value. So up here it's 3 superconks, so they are A1, and A1 is equal to 3. And I'll talk about that later. It'll be relevant later. So now that I have these sorted into groups, see over here we've got them groups top to bottom, and then them subsorted by tank quality in them. So generally speaking, from the top of this list to the bottom, you're gonna have the best tanks for the map towards the worst tanks for the map. And for distributing these, the better side of the map is going to be relevant. So for Westfield, side 1 is the better side of the map for this fight, and is like the positions are significantly better. Side 2 is worse. But I mean, it's not always going to be side 1 is the better side. It depends on the map. This is just specifically for Westfield. So how are these distributed? So this pattern will be the same no matter what. So the best tank for the map will be given to the worst side, which in this case is side 2, and then it distributes 1, 1, 1, and then after that it'll distribute 2 tanks at a time, and still in alternating sides. So in this case, there happens to be 3 superconks, which are obviously the same tank, but 1 superconk is given to side 2, then 1 to side 1, 1 to side 2, and then it gives the Kron and Mouse to side 1, 277, 100 to side 2, and the other 2 to side 1. So all this is dependent on which side of the map is worse, because the top tank will always go to the worst side of the map, and then it'll alternate in this pattern after that. Alright, so after this distribution is completed, these are the teams we have. So side 2, which is the worst side, gets double superconk, 277, E100, and side 1 gets superconk, Kron, Mouse, 5A, 215B. You could argue it's not perfect. I mean, I think it's good enough. I just think there needs to be something like this implemented to prevent the teams from being extremely imbalanced. So like I said earlier, I think medium tanks require the same kind of thing. Not exactly the same, like it'd have the same value, except I think this would be 4 digits. It would probably be speed, armor, sniping, and gun depression, something like that. Every other aspect would function exactly the same, except for like I said, where the top tank, the top heavy tank gets distributed to the worst side of the map. For medium tanks, it would be dependent on the value of A1. So if A1 is an even number, then the best medium tank would go to the worst side of the map. And if A1 is an odd number, then the best medium tank would go to the better side of the map. This is because, for an example like this, where A1 equals 3, then the worst side of the map has 2 of the best tank, and so the best medium tank will go to the better side of the map to supplement the team 2 getting 2 super conks instead of 1. I mean, this is obviously not a perfect system. Even like one hole in it that I found as I was literally making this was let's say A5 or A1 is equal to 5, which is an odd number, and like I said, if A1 is an odd number, then the best medium tank would be distributed to the better side of the map to supplement the worst side of the map getting more of the best heavy tank than the better side of the map. However, if A1 was equal to 5, then based on this pattern of distribution, that would mean the better side of the map would have gotten more of the best heavy tank than the worst side of the map. Obviously, it's not going to be super common where like the top group and the top quality rating it has 5. Like that would be extremely rare, but I mean, definitely not out of the realm of possibility, especially back when they originally buffed the M4 and that thing, God, there was like 3 per team all the time. So I mean, it's obviously not perfect, but again, like I said before, the concept is like really what I wanted to show here, and I think like $1 billion studio with a bunch of professional game designers could probably figure something out that could work here. So, like I said before, I don't think Wargaming ever released a super in-depth mechanics video on how the matchmaker worked. Either that, or I just couldn't find it. So I really don't know how, like the order of operations for their matchmaker. Based on the video that I showed earlier, I'm pretty sure the map is chosen after all the tanks are decided and distributed to the teams, which I obviously would have to change for something like this. Uh, Not as much for this, although you would have to have the map before distributing the tanks to do something like this, obviously. But it's more like I was talking about earlier, where I think there should be a minimum number of light tanks for certain maps. So the map would have to be chosen pretty high up in the order of operations to have something like this function. But it would be interesting to go over, but I really just have absolutely no idea how the matchmaker currently functions. There are also things like how platoons are distributed and how you would have to balance the tanks that are in platoons and stuff. Obviously, that would play some role in a system like this, but again, I there's just no information how any of that functions, so there's just not really much I can say about that. But I mean, there's a bunch of variables that I either haven't thought of, don't have enough information to go over. But there's something like this needs to happen in the game because the current matchmaker is just beyond imbalanced. Whether or not you agree with my concept or some of the changes I went over, I think most people will agree the matchmaker needs a rework in some sort of fashion. Um, Whether or not it's this or something like this, whatever it is, I just hope that the $1 billion game studio can fix their game for once. You know, I think they could probably design something that could work. That being said, I think that's all for this video. There's a few other things I want to make videos about, but that is all depending on whether or not I actually care enough to make them. Either way, if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I'll catch you on the flippity flop.